The flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness of the Nevada highway as UFC champion Ronda Rousey pulled her rental car to the shoulder, her hands already moving to the steering wheel in the 10-2 position she'd been taught since childhood. What should have been a routine traffic stop after leaving a charity event in Las Vegas was about to become a confrontation that would expose the ugly reality of racial profiling and police misconduct, and showcase why you should never underestimate someone who's dedicated their life to protecting others. If you're already feeling the tension, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what Ronda does next is going to completely redefine what it means to be a champion, both inside and outside the ring. Smash that like button too, because this story needs to reach everyone who believes in standing up for what's right. The desert air was thick with summer heat even at 11 p.m. as Officer Derek Matthews approached the black sedan, his flashlight beam dancing across the asphalt. Ronda had been driving back to her hotel after hosting a self-defense workshop for underprivileged teenage girls, an event that had filled her with the kind of purpose that made all her years of training feel worthwhile. She'd been careful to observe the speed limit, knowing that her high-profile status made her a target for both overzealous fans and those looking to make headlines at her expense. But this stop felt different from the moment Matthews tapped on her window. "License and registration," he demanded without preamble, his tone carrying an edge that immediately put Ronda on alert. She'd dealt with law enforcement countless times throughout her career: airport security, venue checks, even friendly encounters with officers who were MMA fans. This interaction had none of that professional courtesy. "Of course, officer," Ronda replied calmly, reaching slowly for her purse while keeping her movements visible. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Matthews ignored her question, instead shining his flashlight directly into her face with unnecessary aggression. "Just get your documents out and keep your hands where I can see them." As Ronda handed over her license, she noticed Matthews' nameplate and badge number, committing them to memory with the same precision she used to study opponents before fights. Something about his demeanor, the way his jaw was set, the slight sneer playing at the corners of his mouth, triggered every instinct she'd developed about reading hostile intentions. "Ronda Rousey," Matthews read from her license, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "The famous fighter. What's someone like you doing in a neighborhood like this?" The question hit Ronda like a physical blow. The neighborhood he was referring to was a well-lit stretch of highway between two upscale casino resorts. There was nothing remotely dangerous or suspicious about her presence there, and they both knew it. But she also recognized the coded language, the way certain people use geography as a weapon when they really meant something else entirely. "I was leaving a charity event at the Bellagio," Ronda answered evenly, though her fighter's instincts were now fully engaged. "Is there a problem, officer?" Matthews circled to the passenger side of the car, his flashlight beam sweeping across the interior with theatrical thoroughness. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. "I need to conduct a search." "A search for what?" Ronda asked, her voice remaining calm despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. "You haven't told me what law I've allegedly broken." "Don't get smart with me," Matthews snapped, his hand moving to rest on his service weapon in a gesture that was clearly meant to intimidate. "I said get out of the car, now!" Ronda complied, moving slowly and deliberately while her mind raced through everything she knew about her rights during traffic stops. As a public figure, she'd been briefed by lawyers about exactly these kinds of situations. She also knew that her celebrity status could either help or hurt her, depending on the officer's motivations. What happened next would be captured on Matthews' body camera, though he seemed to have forgotten he was being recorded. "Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle," Matthews commanded, positioning himself behind Ronda in a way that felt more predatory than procedural. "I need to pat you down for weapons." Rhonda's blood ran cold as she felt Matthew's hands begin what was supposedly a standard search, but his touch lingered in places that had nothing to do with officer safety and everything to do with abuse of power. His hands moved across her body with a deliberate invasiveness that made her skin crawl, his breathing becoming heavier as he took advantage of his position of authority. "This is not a proper search procedure," Ronda said firmly, her voice cutting through the desert silence like a blade. "You're crossing a line, officer." "Shut up and stay still," Matthews hissed, his hands becoming even more inappropriate as he seemed to forget that he was dealing with someone who had spent her entire adult life learning to neutralize threats. "You'll take what I give you and be grateful I don't find something to arrest you for." That's when Ronda Rousey made a decision that would change both their lives forever. In one fluid motion that took less than 3 seconds, Ronda pivoted on her left foot, grabbed Matthew's wrist with her right hand, and executed a perfect judo throw that sent the 200-pound officer flying through the air before landing hard on the asphalt. The technique, a modified SEOE nage that she'd perfected through thousands of hours of training, was delivered with just enough force to neutralize the threat without causing permanent injury. Matthews hit the ground with a grunt of surprise and pain, his flashlight skittering across the pavement as Ronda immediately stepped back and raised her hands to show she posed no further threat. "I defended myself against sexual assault," Ronda announced clearly, knowing that the body camera was recording every word. Officer Matthews was conducting an inappropriate search that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with sexual misconduct. I used the minimum force necessary to stop his illegal behavior. Matthews struggled to his feet, his face flushed with rage and embarrassment. "You just assaulted a police officer," he shouted, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest." "No," Ronda replied, with the calm authority of someone who had faced down opponents in front of millions of viewers. "I defended myself against a sexual predator who happens to wear a badge. And unless you want this body camera footage to become evidence in your criminal trial, I suggest you call your supervisor immediately." The standoff that followed lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. Matthews, clearly realizing that his actions had been recorded and that he was facing an opponent who was both legally informed and physically capable of defending herself, began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Ronda stood perfectly still, her hands visible, her posture non-threatening but ready while she waited for him to make his next move. The sound of approaching sirens broke the tension as backup units arrived, not because Matthews had called for help, but because a passing motorist had seen the confrontation and called 911. Within minutes, the scene was flooded with patrol cars, supervisors, and eventually internal affairs investigators who would spend the next several hours reviewing body camera footage that would end Matthews' career and launch a federal investigation into his department's practices. You're probably wondering how this could escalate so quickly. If you're as shocked as I was, drop "justice" in the comments, because what the investigation revealed about Officer Matthews was even worse than anyone imagined. The body camera footage was damning beyond any doubt. It showed Matthews conducting what could only be described as a sexual assault under color of law, his hands roaming areas of Ronda's body that had no connection to officer safety or legitimate search procedures. More importantly, it captured Ronda's measured response, a defensive technique that neutralized the threat without excessive force, followed by her immediate de-escalation and clear explanation of her actions. But the investigation that followed revealed that Ronda's encounter with Matthews was far from isolated. Internal Affairs discovered a pattern of misconduct spanning Matthews' 8-year career, with particular focus on traffic stops involving women of color. 17 formal complaints had been filed against him, ranging from inappropriate touching during searches to explicitly racist comments during routine encounters. The department had buried these complaints through a combination of intimidation, bureaucratic delays, and outright cover-ups that protected Matthews while silencing his victims. What Ronda did was give voice to every woman who had been victimized by this predator, explained civil rights attorney Maria Santos, who represented several of Matthews' previous victims in the federal lawsuit that followed. Her celebrity status and her ability to defend herself physically meant that for the first time, his actions were captured on camera and couldn't be denied or covered up. The footage of Ronda's perfectly executed defensive throw became a viral sensation, but not for the reasons many expected. Rather than celebrating violence, viewers were struck by her restraint, her immediate de-escalation, and her clear articulation of what had happened. The video became a textbook example of how to respond to police misconduct while protecting both your safety and your legal rights. She used exactly the amount of force necessary to stop the assault and no more, noted Dr. James Chen, a use of force expert who testified in the subsequent trials. Her response was textbook self-defense, immediate, proportional, and followed by immediate de-escalation. It's actually a perfect example of how law enforcement should handle threats, ironically demonstrated by a civilian defending herself against a corrupt officer. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Matthews was fired within a week of the incident, arrested on charges of sexual assault under color of law, and eventually sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. But the impact of Ronda's actions extended far beyond one corrupt officer's downfall. The Nevada Attorney General's office launched a comprehensive investigation into the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department's handling of misconduct complaints, particularly those involving racial bias and sexual assault. The investigation revealed systemic problems that had allowed officers like Matthews to prey on vulnerable citizens for years without consequences. The Rousey incident was a catalyst, explained Attorney General Patricia Williams during a press conference announcing sweeping reforms. It forced us to confront the reality that our oversight systems had failed, and that failure had real victims who deserved justice. The reforms that followed were comprehensive and unprecedented. Every officer in the department was required to undergo new training on appropriate search procedures, racial bias, and sexual assault prevention. Body cameras became mandatory for all interactions with the public, with severe penalties for officers who forgot to activate them. Most importantly, a new independent oversight board was established with the power to investigate misconduct complaints without interference from department leadership. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. Ronda's response to Matthews' assault became a rallying point for police reform advocates, not because she had used violence, but because she had demonstrated that citizens could defend themselves against police misconduct while still respecting the law. Her measured response, captured on camera and disseminated worldwide, provided a template for how to resist abuse of power without escalating to unnecessary violence. "She showed that you don't have to be a victim," said Dr. Angela Davis, a civil rights activist who had worked for decades to combat police brutality. "You can defend yourself, you can demand accountability, and you can do it all while maintaining your dignity and respecting the rule of law." 6 months after the incident, Ronda was invited to speak at the FBI's National Academy, where she addressed law enforcement leaders from across the country about the importance of accountability and the damage that corrupt officers do to public trust. "I didn't throw Officer Matthews because I'm a fighter," she told the assembled police chiefs and federal agents. "I threw him because I'm a citizen who refused to be victimized. Every person in America has the right to be treated with dignity by law enforcement, regardless of their race, gender, or social status. When officers violate that trust, they don't just harm their immediate victims. They undermine the legitimacy of every good officer who risks their life to serve and protect. The speech was met with a standing ovation from an audience that included many officers who had spent their careers fighting against the kind of corruption that Matthews represented. The ripple effects of that night on the Nevada highway continued for years. Matthews's conviction led to the overturning of dozens of cases where his testimony had been crucial, resulting in the release of several people who had been wrongfully convicted based on his perjured testimony. The federal lawsuit filed by his victims resulted in a $12 million settlement and forced the police department to implement additional reforms beyond those mandated by the state. But for Ronda, the most meaningful outcome was personal. 3 years after the incident, she received a letter from Keisha Washington, a 19-year-old college student who had been one of Matthews' victims 2 years before Ronda's encounter. Keisha had been too afraid to report the assault at the time, knowing that her word against the police officers would likely be dismissed. But Ronda's courage in fighting back and speaking out had inspired Keisha to come forward and join the federal lawsuit. "You gave me my voice back," Keisha wrote. "Seeing you stand up to him, seeing you refuse to be a victim, it made me realize that I didn't have to carry his shame. What he did to me was wrong, and I had the right to say so. Thank you for showing me that we don't have to be silent." Ronda kept that letter in her gym bag, reading it whenever she needed a reminder of why her years of training had been about more than just winning fights. The skills she had developed to compete at the highest levels of mixed martial arts had ultimately served a higher purpose, protecting not just herself, but giving voice to others who had been silenced by abuse of power. The charity work that had brought her to Las Vegas that night continued and expanded. Ronda's self-defense workshops for young women now included specific training on how to interact with law enforcement, how to document potential misconduct, and how to seek help when authority figures abuse their power. The workshops were offered free of charge in communities across the country, with particular focus on areas where police-community relations had been strained by incidents of misconduct. Self-defense isn't just about physical techniques, Ronda would tell her students. It's about knowing your rights, understanding your options, and having the confidence to stand up for yourself when someone tries to take advantage of you. Whether that someone is a stranger in a parking lot or a police officer who thinks his badge gives him the right to assault you. 5 years after that night on the highway, Officer Derek Matthews was released from federal prison after serving his full sentence. He emerged to find that his actions had catalyzed changes that made it much harder for corrupt officers to prey on vulnerable citizens. The body camera footage of his encounter with Ronda was now used in police academies across the country as an example of how not to conduct traffic stops, and his case had become a textbook study in the consequences of police misconduct. Meanwhile, Ronda had transitioned from active competition to become one of the most respected voices in the conversation about police reform and women's rights. Her foundation, established with proceeds from the federal lawsuit settlement she had donated back to Matthews's other victims, provided legal support and self-defense training to women who had experienced abuse by authority figures. The night that had started as a routine drive home from a charity event had become a defining moment, not just in Ronda's life, but in the broader struggle for police accountability and civil rights. Her 3-second judo throw had lasted longer in its impact than any of her championship fights, proving that sometimes the most important victories happen outside the ring, when ordinary citizens refuse to accept that abuse of power is just the way things are. Today, the intersection where Ronda's car was pulled over has been renamed Accountability Avenue by local activists, though the official street signs still bear its original name. A small memorial garden nearby honors all victims of police misconduct, with a plaque that reads, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it." Ronda visits the site every year on the anniversary of the incident, not to celebrate violence, but to remember that standing up for what's right sometimes requires us to be willing to defend ourselves and others, even when the person threatening us wears a badge and claims to represent the law. The story of that night continues to inspire people around the world who face abuse of power in their own lives. It serves as a reminder that justice doesn't always come from the system. Sometimes it comes from individuals who refuse to be victims, who stand up for what's right, and who use their strength not to dominate others, but to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Have you ever witnessed or experienced abuse of power by someone in authority? Do you think citizens have the right to defend themselves against police misconduct? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because conversations like these are how we build a society where everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or social status, can expect to be treated with dignity and respect by those sworn to serve and protect. If this story reminded you that courage comes in many forms, share it with someone who needs to know that standing up for what's right is always worth it, even when it's difficult or dangerous.